I think it's fine. Yeah, okay. Thank you. Bapak dan Ibu, sedikit latar belakang, saya yakin kita semua sepakat bahwa isu ini adalah isu yang sangat penting untuk kita bicarakan saat ini. Di tengah ancaman perubahan iklim yang terus meningkat, bagaimana kemudian peran hakim dan peradilan dapat berperan dalam mengatasi hal ini kemudian menjadi sangat amat penting. Saya yakin di kelas hukum perubahan iklim sebelumnya, Bapak dan Ibu juga sudah banyak berdiskusi tentang bagaimana perkembangan climate litigation atau litigasi iklim terus berkembang di global south, termasuk di Indonesia tentunya. Banyak sekali tipenya, mulai dari tipe-tipenya mulai dari isu terkait dengan kegagalan dokumen AMDAL untuk mempertimbangkan dampak perubahan iklim, kemudian bagaimana gugatan-gugatan kebakaran hutan dan lahan, termasuk illegal logging juga terus dikaitkan dengan isu perubahan iklim, dan kita bisa memprediksikan bagaimana ke depannya isu litigasi perubahan iklim ini akan terus berkembang, Bapak dan Ibu. Nah, dari latar belakang tersebut, ada dua hal menarik yang juga menjadi diskursus selama ini. Pertama, termasuk juga tantangannya, utamanya bagaimana kemudian hakim perlu untuk memahami kira-kira scientific basis dari perubahan iklim, termasuk bagaimana hakim dapat mengutilisasi atau menggunakan dokumen-dokumen saintifik seperti IPCC report, NDC, untuk kemudian mendukung argumen sepanjang persidangan atau untuk menjawab legal questions yang terus berkembang, begitu, yang terus muncul, termasuk juga diskursus terkait bagaimana hubungan antara perubahan iklim dan human rights, mengingat dampak dari perubahan iklim ini sangat erat sekali dengan hak-hak dasar manusia. Nah, so we are so humbled to have you here, Professor Dr. Christina Voigt from Oslo. Thank you for joining us. Sebelumnya izinkan saya membacakan CV beliau dalam bahasa Inggris, Bapak dan Ibu. So, Professor Dr. Christina Voigt is currently a professor of law from University of Oslo, Faculty of Law with a specialization in public international law, international environmental law, climate change and energy law, and human rights law. She got her PhD from the University of Oslo, Department of Public and International Law. And prior to that, she earned Master of Laws in Environmental Law from the University of Auckland, New Zealand. She serves so many positions right now. She is currently a co-chair of the Paris Agreements Committee to facilitate implementation and promote the compliance. She is also chair of the IUCN, World Commission of Environmental Law, or WCEL, and elected at IUCN World Conservation Congress. And since 2016, she also becomes the chair of the IUCN WCEL's Specialist Group of Climate Change and member of the Board of Governors International Council of Environmental Law. Bapak dan Ibu, sebelum saya memulai acara, mungkin saya ingin mengingatkan Bapak dan Ibu terlebih dahulu jika ada yang ingin didiskusikan atau ingin ditanyakan untuk Bapak dan Ibu yang ada di Zoom bisa menggunakan feature Q&A. Silahkan untuk drop questions-nya Bapak dan Ibu di kolom Q&A selama diskusi berlangsung. Untuk Bapak dan Ibu yang hadir secara live di Diklat dapat menanyakan secara langsung nanti pada saat Q&A Bapak dan Ibu. Baik, saya akan ke Professor Christina terlebih dahulu. So, Professor Christina, we are so eager to learn from you about how is the trend? How do you see the trend of global climate change litigation? What are the lessons learned? And how do you think that these cases may have kind of tangible impacts on the development of environmental human rights and climate change related policies? And maybe you can also share with us about the scientific debates that judge maybe should anticipate during the trial. Dr. Christina, the time is yours.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Anindarini. First of all, let me express my deep gratitude for being invited to give that inspirational lecture. I hope I can be inspiring. It is, as you said, it's a very difficult topic. It's a complex topic. It's urgent. It's challenging. So drawing out inspiration from that is a bit of an uphill battle, but I'll try my best. But before I start, let me please thank the Indonesian Center for Environmental Law for inviting me. It's a great opportunity to engage in a discussion which I think is absolutely crucial. It's absolutely important, and it's a discussion where many judges all over the world are currently engaged and are currently thinking, how to tackle that. And I'm happy to provide some input, some reflections about what is going on, what are the trends, what are the cases we're seeing, and I'm also very much looking forward to the discussion. I'm sorry, the discussion afterwards. I would also like to thank Dr. Bambang for his kind introduction from Stockholm, which is only like 6 hours from where I am currently. I'm looking forward to meeting you tomorrow. Now, let me start without further ado to dive into my presentation. I also wanted to thank those Supreme Court judges that came to Oslo about a month ago. It was a wonderful visit. I was on my way to Geneva, so I had only very short time to be there, but I really enjoyed that morning that I was allowed to be with you, and I assume that some of the judges are here in the audience. It was a very great exchange, and it also showed the depth of knowledge already being there, and the questions that were raised were just spot on. So let me start sharing my screen so that I can explain in more detail what I am going to do. So the topic of my talk is the contribution of the courts in tackling climate change, and it's a really challenging topic because it shouldn't be the courts that tackle climate change, but in the absence of action that is commensurate to what needs to be done according to what science tells us, and also in the face of some private actors going forward in climate damaging behavior, it is by the end of the day the courts that are stepping in, and they are the third pillar of power in a democratic system, and of course have the legitimate role to hold those to account that do not act in accordance with the law. What I will do is I will first give a little bit of a scientific background. As Grita indicated, it is very important to understand what climate science says. I'm sure many of you are well aware, but it's maybe helpful to update of where the cutting edge in climate science currently is. I will then second give some information about where you can actually find or get access to many of the cases that are being decided currently worldwide. What are the databases? Which kind of reports can be accessed in order to get more information? I then will provide some case examples of maybe the most influential cases that we've seen so far, although it's a very difficult selection. There's so much going on, and just choosing a couple of pages due to the time limit that we have is challenging, but I'll try. And then in the end, I'll offer some reflections, some observations from my side. So let me start with the science first. I mean, tackling climate change is such a big challenge, and it is very difficult to say exactly what it means. So the guiding instrument that we have that puts the world on a track to tackle climate change in terms of addressing the causes of climate change, which is called mitigation, but at the same time addressing the consequences, the impacts of climate change, which is usually referred to as adaptation. So the global instrument that we have is the Paris Agreement, which was adopted in 2015, entered into force in 2016, and Indonesia is a party to the agreement together with 194 other parties. The Paris Agreement kind of gives us a direction of travel. You know, you could say stopping climate change could be at 1 degree, so at 5 degrees, or at 4 degrees, but the direction of travel to which pretty much the whole world has agreed to is that we seek to hold the increase in global average temperatures to well below 2 degrees, and trying to pursue efforts to keep it even lower to 1.5 degrees. This is written into the Article 2 of the Paris Agreement. Now, this is, sorry, I lost the, can you still see me?
Yes.
Yeah, I kind of lost my slides. I don't know where they are. Let me see. I'm sorry for that. Yeah. The agreement is, in a way, the global social compact in addressing climate change, and it tells us where we need to go. It also makes it a bit more specific, because keeping warming to well below 2 degrees doesn't say so much about what exactly needs to be done. So we have to break it down into how much greenhouse gas emissions are still possible in order to keep that temperature goal in reach. And here the Paris Agreement itself gives a bit more indication in Article 4, where it talks about global peaking as soon as possible, and then reducing greenhouse gas emissions drastically in accordance with best available science, so to achieve a balance between emissions and removals in the second half of the century. And you see that I highlighted the words "in accordance with best available science," because that is the element of the agreement that at any given point in time draws in the most recent assessments by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, which means that the Paris Agreement can be read and interpreted in a dynamic fashion at all points in time in light with best available science. And the IPCC just earlier this year published its 6th assessment report. The IPCC itself does not carry out any scientific research, but it assesses where globally the cutting edge of science is, the best available peer-reviewed science, and puts this together in assessment reports which are publicly available. So the latest report, the 6th assessment reports, repeats in a way what is already written in the Paris Agreement, that peaking of global emissions, meaning that we can't increase anymore, we have to stabilize the emissions, has to happen within the next 3 years by 2025, which is an enormous challenge. But that's, of course, not where it stops. After 2025, emissions have to be reduced by about 50%, 45% by 2030. That's the end of this current decade. That's also why it's called the critical decade. Halving global emissions within 1 decade is where we need to go. In order to reach global net zero emissions, where the emissions equal out removals, so we have net zero or carbon neutrality, it's another term for it, and then have to keep emissions to net negative until the end of the century. I know these are a lot of numbers and they still have to be broken down, but this is in general the trajectory where the entire world has to go in order to keep in line with the goals as expressed in the Paris Agreement. And these are the 3 latest parts of the 6th assessment report. There are links behind every one of these files. I'm happy to make my presentation available to the audience, so you can click on them and you get to the documents, which are huge documents. But these are the summaries for policymaker for each one of the 3 parts of the 6th assessment report. You see, one deals with the physical scientific basis, the second one with the impacts on adaptation, and the most recent one that just came out about 2 months ago about mitigation possibilities. What has to be done and what can still be done in order to keep climate change to well below 2 degrees. As I said, the 3rd part of the 6th assessment report was just published about 2 months ago, and it in very clear terms says that it's still possible to keep global warming to well below 2 degrees, but the time is now to do so. The time to get into motion the changes that are necessary in basically all sectors, that time it's now, or it is never. if we miss that window of opportunity that we have currently, we will not be able to keep warming to 2 degrees. It will overshoot. It will go all the way to 3 or 4 or 5 degrees, and then all the bets are basically off. But the report itself is quite optimistic because it outlines options for changes in all sectors, in particular the energy sector, which of course energy is important for development, energy is important for economics, for social development, but it is in most cases still based on the use of fossil fuels, on burning of coal, oil, and gas. And that sector is the one that needs the most drastic changes, a switch, a transformation to using renewables, and hand in hand, of course, with using energy more efficiently. But it's not only the energy sector, it cuts across all sectors. And that's the challenge of climate change, because it's not just one type of gas, it's different, it's a whole basket of different gases that accumulate in the atmosphere. And so it is pretty much everything we do that leads to the release of greenhouse gas emissions, which means that's pretty much everything we do that has to go through what is called transformational changes. That applies to industrial processes, that applies to agriculture, forestry, other land uses, and that's of course of particular importance to Indonesia as well, with your forest policy, palm oil industry, agricultural policies, which are very crucial to the development of Indonesia, but which also have come with challenges on their own. And you already addressed illegal logging, which is one example of activities that need to be addressed and that bubble up all the way to the courts. But it also deals with the financial sector, of which financial flows go where, which incentives, which subsidies are provided, or which disincentives are provided. And that, by the end of the day, is also a matter of law, because it is something that is done through laws, regulations, acts that tell the financial sector, banks, investors, or where to put their money or where not. Now, this is all, of course, not easy. There is no question about it that we're looking at a massive challenge, and the IPCC titles it as unprecedented challenges. We have to see rapid, far-reaching transitions across all sectors, and these transitions have to be systemic. They have to cut across everything we do, all sectors, all values, all systems, but they're also unprecedented. We're looking at something that the world has never had to do before, collectively, globally, and in such a short window of time. So having said that, I did have a look at Indonesia's contribution to the Paris Agreement. As you perhaps know, every party to the agreement has the obligation to put forward what is called a nationally determined contribution, an NDC. These NDCs are publicly available. They are all in the public registry at the website of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. So you can just go there, Google, and find the NDCs of each country. And Indonesia's NDC, or updated NDC, is just about a year old. And it's a very interesting document to read, because it gives an indication of where Indonesia within this decade until 2030 is planning to go. And it has fairly ambitious targets. It has an unconditional target to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 29%, but it moves up that target to 41% conditioned upon international finance. And that is, of course, both very ambitious, but also very unsure whether that finance is on the table. And that's one reason why we see these continuous global meetings of all countries in order to get developing countries together, and also to get the finance flows to where they need to go. And as you see here, Indonesia has a particular target in the forest sector by peatland restoration. You know, peatlands contain a significant amount of carbon. Peatlands restoration is very important, and rehabilitation of degraded land by 12 million hectares until 2030. And again, as I indicated earlier, the energy sector, equally important for Indonesia as for all other countries, looking at a different mix of energy where there is an increase of new and renewable energy of about 23% and over 30% in 2050. So these are ambitious targets. These targets will or already have been partly included in regulations and acts. And that, of course, brings also to the forefront the possibility for litigation, as we've seen in many other countries that have adopted climate acts, where we have citizens engaged, NGOs, that bring forward climate claims saying this is not ambitious enough, or you don't have the right measures in place to live up to the targets you set yourself. And where the courts tell governments to implement more effective measures in line with the targets they themselves have set. Or in some cases, we had courts that actually tell governments to take more ambitious targets, but that's pretty much an exception to what courts these days are telling, where they find governments accountable. But I'll come back to that in a moment. So that's like the scientific, the background of international policy making, science, and of course how Indonesia fits into this general picture. Now let us move more into this issue of climate change litigation. As I said, it's a global wave where we see many courts in many countries being engaged in lawsuits and claims that deal with climate change in different contexts. And I have a slide where I try to outline the different contexts. But it is, it is a global phenomenon. And it's almost moving too fast to follow suit. It is so much happening in very short periods of time that it's very helpful to have some reports that I just wanted to highlight to you, where you can get maybe a bit more systemic information about what is happening, which courts, where, what arguments are being brought forward, which arguments have been successful, which have been rejected. And here I just wanted to highlight three fairly recent reports, one from the Geneva Association, which is called Climate Change Litigation: Insights into the Evolving Global Landscape. It's about a year old, and there's a link to it if you're interested. The ADB, the Asian Development Bank, is very active in providing a forum for judges to meet, but also in analyzing the global landscape on climate litigation. And the bank published a report in 2020 called Climate Change Coming Soon to a Court Near You. And finally, the United Nations Environment Programme is regularly publishing reports on climate change litigation. This one here is from 2020, but I know they're working on an update, which is supposed to be published later this year. In addition to these reports put forward by different associations and organizations, what is also very important and very interesting for many scholars, academics, but also judges, is our publicly accessible databases. Databases where you can Google countries and you can look find countries and can look what kind of climate litigation is happening in these different countries, or different courts. You can find, you can search in accordance with a jurisdiction or with a country or with the issue at stake. They're very elaborate databases and very interesting to use. One is maintained by the Seventh Center for Climate Change Law at New York Columbia University in New York City. And the second one is maintained by the Grantham Research Institute of the London School of Economics in the UK. And the second one is interesting because it does have that database of cases of claims put forward, but it also has a database of climate laws and policies. So where you can actually look at different countries' legislation in the field of climate change and not just litigation. Now, let's move on to that phenomenon of climate change litigation. It's a fairly recent phenomenon. It's something that hasn't been around for a long time. It started in the early 2000s, just a little bit. And you see that in particular in the United States, which is a very litigation active country, we had significant increase of litigation just in 2006, 7, 8. And then it stabilized. But with the adoption of the Paris Agreement in 2015, we've seen another significant increase, both in the United States, but also we see many cases coming forward. That's the blue parts here of those columns in other parts of the world. And then the pandemic hit, and of course that was, we saw a decline, but this is on the rise again. Now, what kind of cases are being put forward? It's a very complex field of law, which is not just thinking about climate change, reducing greenhouse gas emissions. It is much more, and many more different aspects are now being put to courts. We have two main avenues of climate litigation. One avenue are claims against governments. And the other avenue, which is in my next slide, are claims against private actors, primarily against companies. But even when it comes to claims that are put forward against states, against governments, we have a whole selection of different claims, a whole suite of different reasons that are being put forward for judicial review. Of course, a very important aspect are claims that are based or that seek to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. They are either based on national climate laws or maybe on constitutional provisions that talk about the needs of the government to protect the environment. But we have quite a few of these cases put forward. But you see, there is so much more. There are procedural aspects, and we already indicated that in the beginning, that deal with social environmental impact assessments that have not been carried out accordingly to the existing laws. For example, we had a case here in Norway that was partly based on a constitutional provision, but also on the requirement for environmental impact assessment of allowing new oil licenses and new oil drilling. And traditionally, these environmental impact assessments, they looked at the climate impact of the drilling activity, but it did not look at the overall impact on climate change globally. Norway produces a lot of oil and gas, but most of these oil and gas products are being sold to other countries. They are not burned in Norway to create energy. They're sold to countries outside of Norway, where of course oil and gas is being burned and where greenhouse gas emissions then are happening. And the question in the environmental impact assessment case is whether Norway or whether the private entities are actually required to assess the environmental impact of greenhouse gas emissions that are happening due to the exported oil and gas products. And just an example, we have many cases now that deal with human rights bases, human rights violations, primarily by young people, children, that are worried about their own future and that are already seeing an impact on their right to life, right to private life, discrimination cases in terms of discriminating children and their future as opposed to what we are doing currently. But human rights cases are on the rise, and I'll come back to that in a moment. But you see also many other elements. Just transition is becoming a very important issue because we cannot forget about workers' rights, labor rights, in that transition away from a fossil fuel industry. It has to happen in a way that protects those rights as well. Otherwise, it is something that is not in accordance with the law. So finding that difficult balance between transitioning our economies fast enough in accordance with what science tells us, but at the same time taking care of the social requirements that have to be protected, social rights that have to be protected, is a challenging situation. And where exactly to land that balance is sometimes very difficult, and therefore it has come up to courts in several cases now. What else do we have? We have here at the end public assembly issues that are now also being dealt with by many cases, where we have examples of civil disobedience, people, children, young people going to the streets, demonstrating, but also blocking the traffic, for example, carrying out certain activities where they want to create awareness around this issue of climate change, but this may come or collide with the right of free speech or public assembly. And these issues are also being increasingly dealt by courts. I don't want to go through the entire suite of bases for legal claims, but I just wanted to show you that climate litigation can be many different things. It's a whole catalog of different claims that are currently being heard by courts, which all in one way or the other are connected with the issue of climate change in terms of dealing with greenhouse gas emissions or adapting to the consequences. And we have a similar landscape when it comes to private actors or corporations, where we seeing more and more cases being brought. The first wave was primarily against public actors, against states or sub-state actors. And now the second wave is looking more on accountability of private actors, not just corporations, also individuals like CEOs of companies or bank directors. But we are like currently just at the very beginning of that second wave. Claims brought against corporations seek, of course, reduction of greenhouse gas emissions, but we also see increasing claims that, or number of claims that actually deal with compensation for climate change damages. That is new. We haven't had any case against the government yet that seeks compensation for damages, but we see cases coming forward where corporations are try to be made accountable for climate change damages. And we had a very interesting development in Germany, where a Peruvian farmer is suing a major energy company in Germany. And the Peruvian farmer says that due to the contribution of that energy company in Germany, his home is under threat. He lives in the Peruvian Andes, and there's a huge glacier above his home village, which is melting. And of course, the waters are threatening that little village to being eroded. And what happened just about a week ago is that the judges of that German court traveled to Peru to have a look on site of how this actually looks like. Is really that farmer threatened by the impact of climate change? And then, of course, they have to find in that case the responsibility and liability of that German company contributing to global climate change, contributing to what's happening in Peru, and finding a compensation basis for that farmer's life and health and property. Very, very interesting development just last week. But we also see cases that deal with misleading advertisement by many companies, cases that deal with, for example, oil companies who deny that they knew about climate change, despite the fact that this was publicly available information for many decades, or that picture themselves as being green and dealing with renewables, while at the core, of course, they're still oil companies. So these are just a number of different claims that we're currently seeing being brought against corporations. And in Indonesia, you have a very interesting landscape as well. As I told you, there is this database where you can just plot in the country that you're interested in. And so I just plotted in Indonesia because I just wanted to see what is going on. And that is the fascinating result that I could find. Many of these cases are pending, they're not yet decided, but you see that you have in many cases the Environment Ministry bringing cases against private corporations, and they deal with illegal palm plantation, land cleaning, and the environment and climate impacts caused by those activities. So this is an interesting development. It's fairly recent, and I guess many of these cases are just in the initial stage, but it is something to watch, and the whole world is watching due to these publicly accessible databases. Let me give you some very brief examples so that you get a better idea of what I'm talking about. And Grita, if I'm moving close to the end of my talk, just give me a brief indication and I'll wrap up.
Yeah, sure.
Thank you. Maybe the most famous case, which probably you've heard about, is a case in the Netherlands, which was decided by the Supreme Court of the Netherlands in 2019. So it's just 3 years ago. But it started in 2015 and was a claim brought by a non-governmental organization called Urgenda, the Urgenda Foundation, on behalf of its own, but also on behalf of almost 1,000 citizens of the Netherlands. And the claim was that the Netherlands climate target was not ambitious enough. It was only 17% of emission reductions. And Urgenda said that needed to be higher. It needed to be at least 25% or all the way up to 40%, but definitely not just 17%. And it brought this claim to the Court of First Instance, the District Court in Hague. And the Hague Court indeed ordered the government to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 25% by 2020. And legally, from a legal perspective, the fascinating element here is that the legal basis for judicial review was a general duty of care that is included in tort law. Tort law that is a part of the Dutch Civil Code. And that duty of care is not even explicitly written. It's more of a conduct in accordance with proper social behavior or something like this. But this was being interpreted by the court. What is that duty of care that applies to everyone, including the government? And in interpreting that duty of care, the court, and you see here the Supreme Court, drew in both human rights, it drew in constitutional provisions, it used the Paris Agreement, it used the precautionary principle, all these elements in order to interpret and give meaning to that duty of care, and found that the state indeed had the obligation to increase its level of ambition to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 25% and not just 17%. This case was, of course, appealed by the government and went all the way up to the court hierarchy, but it was upheld by all courts, by the Court of Appeal, and finally by the Supreme Court in 2019. A second very important case is just from last year, also from the Netherlands, unfortunately, but a lot of very interesting developments are going on there, which seem to inspire litigants all over the world, but also judges that very carefully seem to read those judgments and refer to them in their own jurisdiction. It's another interesting phenomenon, which I will come back to in the end. This case has only been decided so far by the Court of First Instance. It hasn't gone through all the way to the Supreme Court yet. But in this case, also an NGO called Vereniging Milieudefensie, you see the title in the heading, brought a case against a private company, a corporation called Royal Dutch Shell, which is a multinational corporation, but it has its main seat in the Netherlands, and that's why the claim was launched against it in the Netherlands. And in this case, the claimants requested that Royal Dutch Shell reduces its greenhouse gas emissions by 45% in 2030. And you remember that number, it's absolutely in line with what the IPCC says, and it's in line with the Paris Agreement, although the Paris Agreement doesn't apply directly to corporations. But the only thing that this NGO did was requesting that global corporation to act in accordance with international science, climate change science. And the legal basis, again, was that duty of care in the Dutch Civil Code, which, as I said, applies to everyone, including also private companies. And in this case, the Court of First Instance held with the claimants and ordered Royal Dutch Shell to limit its greenhouse gas emissions, its CO2 emissions, to at least 45% by the end of 2030. And it's not just the greenhouse gas emissions in the Netherlands, but it applies to all companies, to all parts of the Royal Dutch Shell Group, which operates in over 160 countries. So we'll see how this goes, but it's definitely a case that has been discussed a lot and talked a lot and created a lot of attention. For your interest, I just included the provision in the Dutch Civil Code here so that you get an idea of how this is being based. As I said, it's a tort act in the Dutch Civil Code, and the entire claim, both against the state in the agenda case, but also against Royal Dutch Shell, is based on this article, Article 6162, and here paragraph 2, where it says, as a tortious act is regarded a violation of someone else's right and an act or omission in violation of a duty imposed by law, or, and that's the important part here, or of what according to unwritten law has to be regarded a proper social conduct. So that's that unwritten duty of care. What is a proper social conduct in the context of the climate challenge? And the courts use that unwritten proper social conduct, they call it duty of care, and interpret it in the light of science by the IPCC, of the Paris Agreement, and also of human rights obligations, which of course also do not directly apply to private corporations. So that's what happened in that particular case in the Netherlands. We also have a fascinating development in Germany, where just last year, the German Federal Constitutional Court ordered the federal government to adjust its Climate Protection Act. The Climate Protection Act implements the Paris Agreement into German law, and it also included that goal of carbon neutrality by 2050, in line with the Paris Agreement and in line with the IPCC. But what that act did not do was to say when exactly do which measures have to be taken. It just said by 2050 Germany has to be carbon neutral, but it didn't really say when this was happening. And there were fairly young claimants, youth and children, that said this is discriminating us because we are just pushing the hardest measures into the future. Currently, we just see business as usual, but by the time we grow up, we will have to bear the most drastic measures of reducing greenhouse gas emissions. So what the German Constitutional Court did was it said this is violating liberty rights of young people today because they have to be seen in a intertemporal manner. You cannot push the hardest measures into the future. That is discriminating them. Everybody has a right to certain liberties, and they have to be allocated equitably over time in an intertemporal manner. It was a completely new concept that the court had never used before. It was absolutely new and quite interesting to study. And based on that, the court ordered the German government to revise its act and to include specific measures from now on until 2050, so that the allocation of measures is fair and equitable. So the whole argument was based on this provision in the German Constitution, Article 2, paragraph 2, that everybody shall have the right to live, to life and physical integrity, and that freedom of a person shall be inviolable, and that the restriction of freedom can only be done by law, but in a way that is fair and equitable. The German government immediately turned around and immediately revised that act, and in accordance with what the Constitutional Court had told the government, included more specific measures within 2 months or something after the court judgment, which was quite a fascinating interlinkage between the judiciary and, of course, the legislative branch of the government. And the last case that I wanted to show you is from another part of the world. That, as I said, it was very difficult to choose cases. I could have chosen many cases from Pakistan or Argentina, but I just went with those couple of cases here. But this is an interesting one because it dealt with deforestation of the Colombian Amazon, the part of the Amazon that is in Colombia. And again, young claimants, children, youth, that said that this deforestation of the Amazon is damaging climate change. It's damaging the environment, and it's contributing to climate change because of the greenhouse gas emissions that follow from cutting down the forest. And they were worried about their own rights, but also the future of the planet, but also the future of the forest itself. And the Supreme Court of Colombia held with the claimants and stated that for the sake of protecting this vital ecosystem, the forest ecosystem, for the future of the planet, it considered the Colombian Amazon as an entity, a legal entity in itself, subject to own rights and a beneficiary of protection, conservation, maintenance, and restoration. And this is another interesting development we currently see, that we have more and more courts coming forward and grant rights to environmental elements like forests or rivers or wetlands, not as environmental objects that need to be protected, but environmental subjects that actually do have a right to protection. And it's an interesting doctrinal debate if this is in any way better and increases environmental protection, but it is a development we are seeing, and we're seeing it in many different countries. My final slide.
Yeah. I'm sorry, 10 minutes more?
Oh, yeah, I won't need 10 minutes, but thank you so much, Grita.
Sure.
My final slide here on cases deals with human rights violations with regard to climate change impacts. And here, except for the cases in the Netherlands on Agenda and Shell, we don't really have any human rights court, regional human rights court yet, that has heard a case or decided a case on human rights violations. But we have, at least here in Europe, a very fascinating development where currently there are 4 cases pending before the European Court of Human Rights in Strasbourg. That court has jurisdiction over the European Convention on Human Rights, which has currently 33 member states. And we have 4 cases pending, and I listed them all here, and they are going to be on the docket of the court within the next couple of months or years, but none of them is decided yet. But all cases deal with basically the claim that the respective governments do too little. Their climate ambition is too low in order to protect the individuals, the victims, from human rights violations. And here we particularly look at the violation of the right to life in Article 2 of the European Convention on Climate Change, or the right to private life. There is no environmental right in the European Convention on Human Rights. It is something that is not part really of the convention. And for that reason, what is required or requested of the court is to interpret the existing rights, like right to life, right to private life, in an environmental context, in a human rights, in a climate change context. And the court has done that in many different cases so far with regard to waste management and wetland protection, but the court has never yet dealt with climate change and interpreting, for example, the right to life or the right to private life with regard to what is required of a government, of a state, to take effective measures, necessary measures to prevent those human rights from being violated by the impacts of climate change. That's a completely new legal issue. It's a new question which the court is now tasked to answer. And of course, we are all very, very excited here and wait for these judgments to come forward. And hopefully the court will be wise enough to put forward a valid interpretation of Article 2 and 8 in the light of climate change. This first case here deals with 6 Portuguese young people. 2 of them are still children. You don't see the little girl here. Young people who claim that both their home government, Portugal, but also all the other member states of the European Convention on Human Rights do not have climate policies and laws in place that are commensurate to what science tells us. Their level of ambition is too low, and because of that, they're contributing to climate change in a way that violates those children or youth human rights. We have a case against Norway, Greenpeace against the Ministry of Petroleum and Energy in Norway, which deals again with those climate oil production licenses. And here the claimants say that the continuous contribution of Norway's greenhouse gas emissions due to the exported oil and gas products is something that violates those claimants' human rights. And then we have 2 more cases, quite interesting. This one is brought by a young man who has a physical condition which gets worse the warmer it gets. So he has a very individual condition where he is prone to the impacts of climate change worsening his medical condition. And so he says, as long as his government is not doing enough, and that's Austria, to address greenhouse gas emissions, his private life, right to health will be impacted by the inaction of his government. And finally, this last case is brought not by youth, but by a group of people at the other end of the life span, by senior elderly women from Switzerland who are very worried about being exposed to warmer summers, to forest fires. And they say climate change is in particular impacting their right to life because they're all suffering from different medical conditions, and they cannot or see that this is getting worse due to the impacts of climate change. So all these cases are now being at the docket of the European Court on Human Rights, and we are waiting with great excitement to see what the court is going to say. Now, that's my final slide. Some observations of where does this take us to, and what are we looking at? Well, certainly it is a global phenomenon, as I already indicated. It's something that we see in so many parts of the world. And there are some reasons for that. One reason is the immediate access to what's happening somewhere else through these global databases. You can just go there, type in a country, type in a court, and you see what's happening in the Inter-American system or in Pakistan or in Brazil. And that, of course, is inspiring, but it also keeps litigators informed. It keeps judges informed about what's happening in other parts of the world. another reason for this global phenomenon is also very active networks of both litigators, claimants, but also networks of judges. In many cases, judges know each other, they talk to each other, they learn from each other, they hear about their different experiences, they get inspired or worried. and there's this global discourse also amongst the members of the judiciary, which is very interesting and which leads to these references to different cases, where we have case in Australia referring to the case in the Netherlands, or a case in Pakistan referring to the decision in France. Really this global cross fertilization of judgments due to the impact of those networks. But a recurring issue is always that question of whether it's law or politics, and how much should courts do and how much is actually an issue of the legislator and should rest with parliament or the government. Now, what we see from the cases that have been decided is, of course, that courts do not make the law, but what they do is they use the tools that they have. They interpret the acts, they interpret constitutional provisions or human rights provisions in new ways by taking into account the challenges of climate change. What does climate change mean to a right to property? What obligations flow from it in that new context of climate change? And they hold those accountable that can be proven acting not in alignment with the law, that break the law. But it's not that the courts, of course, establish new rules and principles. And we see this with, for example, the example that I gave you, this issue of due diligence or duty of care, which has been in the Tort Act for many, many decades. But now it's been used and interpreted in the light of climate change. The same with human rights, the same with freedom rights. Equity issues are being interpreted, drawing in climate change. But we also see very fascinating developments of extending the temporal scope of rights. It's not just right here, right now, but also right here, but stretching into the future because of that long lasting impact of climate change, which is also a very interesting legal development. And also intergenerational rights, intergenerational equity that more and more informs the interpretation of existing statutory rights. The right to a clean and healthy and sustainable environment has not yet been used so much in climate change litigation. It is found in many constitutions worldwide. Internationally, you may know that there was a resolution by the Human Rights Council, but it's not legally binding. But I think the more the discourse consolidates around the right to a clean, healthy environment, the more it may actually be used in domestic litigation in order to interpret existing human rights or as a right on its own. But that's something that it's still coming. We haven't really seen this yet. As I mentioned, the second last point here, we see the use and reference to cases from different jurisdictions, like this global cross-fertilization. I already mentioned that in different judgments, but judges refer to what's happening in other parts of the world. It's not necessarily a doctrinal source of law. I don't think any jurisdiction has, judgments from other parts of the world as a doctrinal source of law, but it is used as an interpretative or supporting argument. It has been done like this in that country or like this in the other country, and we do it here in our court in a similar way. And finally, my last point here is the support of these global networks in the legal community, for example, through the International IUCN World Commission on Environmental Law, or the Global Judicial Institute for the Environment, which today and tomorrow has a big symposium here in Stockholm, where many judges are getting together, and one topic again is climate change. And that exchange of experiences and ideas is really a supporting factor in that global phenomenon. I end with that final slide from the report by the Asian Development Bank. I think it's very telling, where it says that we say to judges, uphold the law, protect rights, balance interests, and rely on science. And it doesn't say make law, but uphold the law and interpret it in light of science, and really look at what rights are at stake and how to balance them, in particular between today and tomorrow, the future that will come and that will be so different. It continues saying, by be vigilant and watch for the day when climate change comes to your court, because tomorrow will dawn, and in it our children must build their lives in the world that we create. And as I said in the beginning, it is really only this window of opportunity that we have right now, and the choices we make today will be the choices that affect our children's life for many decades to come. Let them stand on the shoulders of those who advocate for integrity, justice, and fairness. And I hope these were inspiring words, and I stop here and thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Professor Voigt, for all of the enlightenment for us. Saya mencoba, I would like to summarize first your presentation. May I? From before we go to the discussion. Jadi tadi mungkin sedikit Bapak dan Ibu bagaimana Profesor Christina Voigt telah menjelaskan kepada kita secara global ada sebuah kesepakatan bagaimana kita berusaha untuk membatasi kenaikan suhu di atas 1,5 derajat Celcius dalam artikel 2 dari Paris Agreement, kemudian bagaimana pengurangan emisi gas rumah kaca ini perlu untuk sesuai dengan ilmu pengetahuan yang tersedia atau best available science, dan ini juga kemudian tadi Profesor Christina telah meng-highlight bagaimana climate change litigation ini adalah sebuah fenomena global yang bergerak sangat amat cepat, mulai dari, dan banyak sekali tipenya. Tadi ada bagaimana tipe yang pertama meminta pertanggungjawaban atau klaim terhadap pemerintah, yang kedua terhadap perusahaan, bagaimana terhadap pemerintah misalnya ada juga banyak sekali tipenya, dan memang yang paling banyak adalah tadi yang di-highlight tentang kegagalan untuk mengurangi emisi gas rumah kaca dan kaitannya dengan pemenuhan hak atas lingkungan hidup. Beberapa contohnya tadi mungkin telah diangkat juga kasusnya, mulai dari kasus Uganda dan sebagainya. Kemudian ada isu terkait dengan aspek prosedural di sana, terkait dengan perizinan dan environmental impact assessment, yang bagaimana hal tersebut tidak melihat impact perubahan iklim dalam pertimbangannya. Ada kasus di Jerman tadi terkait dengan Shell, kalau nggak salah terkait dengan hal ini. Kemudian terkait dengan menggunakan human rights basis, beberapa kasus, cukup banyak kasus yang masuk terhadap hal ini, bagaimana utamanya banyak sekali sekarang mulai berkembang bagaimana anak-anak muda atau anak-anak kemudian menjadi penggugat gitu ya, atau pemohon karena right to life mereka, hak hidup mereka terancam dan mendiskriminasikan masa depan mereka. Ini banyak sekali kasusnya juga tadi di Jerman, kemudian di Kolombia, tadi juga Profesor Christina mengatakan. Kemudian kasus-kasus yang kemudian meminta pertanggungjawaban terhadap perusahaan juga cukup banyak, mulai dari kegagalan dalam mengurangi emisi gas rumah kaca mereka, kemudian greenwashing itu juga jadi sesuatu yang cukup berkembang saat ini, termasuk kompensasi dalam climate change damages yang cukup mulai berkembang saat ini juga dalam masuk ke dalam persidangan. Banyak sekali sebenarnya tadi Profesor Voigt menyatakan bagaimana penggunaan rules dan prinsip-prinsip ini terus berkembang, mulai dari human rights, duty of care, intergenerational equity, freedom rights juga, dan bagaimana kemudian hakim mencoba untuk, mungkin ini juga telah tertera dalam hukum atau dalam undang-undang di berbagai negara, namun bagaimana kemudian hakim mencoba untuk menafsirkan dengan cara-cara yang baru, novelty, dengan mencoba untuk menginkorporasikan isu climate change di sana. Baik, Bapak dan Ibu, kita masih punya cukup waktu untuk mungkin kita diskusi. Saya untuk Bapak dan Ibu yang ada di dalam Zoom mungkin bisa langsung mencantumkan pertanyaannya di kolom chat. Tapi mungkin saya ingin menyampaikan pertama kali kesempatan kepada Bapak dan Ibu yang ada di diklat terlebih dahulu, mungkin yang ada di ruangan. Apakah ada yang ingin bertanya atau berdiskusi, Bapak dan Ibu? Mungkin bisa dibantu panitia yang di ruangan. Jika ada, mungkin. Apakah ada? Mungkin panitia boleh dibantu? Atau saya mungkin sambil menunggu, saya mencoba membacakan satu pertanyaan. I would like to read one question first, Professor Christina, in the chat box while we are waiting for the question from the participants in the room. So the question is from Professor Bambang Hero Saharjo. So he joined the COP in Madrid and last COP in Glasgow as an Indonesian delegation. And one of the big issue was the 1.5 degree Celsius achievement. It is really hard to reach as it happened at last COP, as the pit fires produce huge amounts of greenhouse gases. And we do hope that law of enforcement hopefully becomes one of the solution. But the challenge is sometimes there is a different perception, because companies finally not found guilty, even though those companies behind of the fire of forest fires are supported by scientific evidence. So the question is, how court could tackling the climate change as we have the case like this, like sometimes there are different perceptions because companies finally not found guilty. This is one question from Profesor Bambang Hero Saharjo. Is there any question? Ada pertanyaan lain mungkin dari Bapak dan Ibu yang ada di ruangan? Mungkin panitia, jika ada. Oke, jika belum mungkin boleh, maybe Professor Christina, maybe you would like to answer the question first.
Yeah, I'm happy to, and it's a very pertinent question. Well, first of all, let's start in the beginning about the 1.5 degree goal. It wasn't adopted in Glasgow. It was in the Paris Agreement already, as I said. But what is very interesting from Glasgow is that the parties to the Paris Agreement, in their decision from the COP in Glasgow, put into that decision more specific of what exactly needs to be done in order to stay within 1.5 degree. And that's where we see the reference to reducing 45% by 2030 and reaching net zero by 2050. That was a big achievement from Glasgow, that parties actually agreed to include the science from the IPCC in a decision from the COP, like really copy pasted into a decision, so that it's very clear to everyone, this is where we globally need to go. Now, what this means to, when it breaks down to what has to happen on your national territory, every country has to make its own national plan, national determined contribution, as I already indicated. And here in this case, Indonesia's NDC talks about rehabilitation of deforested land, protection of peatlands, and so forth. I'm not sure how and where this is included in the Indonesian regulation. I'm sure there are acts or decrees that actually make it into law, or they probably will come. So the conduct of private companies has to be assessed against the legal landscape. What does the law require? Is it allowed to clear peatlands, to burn peatlands, or to clear the forest? And if so, what kind of environmental or social impact assessment has to be carried out before this is possible? And these are questions that perhaps are coming up to the courts currently. It's procedural elements in terms of these environmental impact assessment, and it is also substantive elements of what exactly is required by those laws, by those Indonesian regulations. And I'm not sure how free judges are to also apply tort law, like in the Netherlands. That might be something that is not part of the Indonesian legal culture, but it's perhaps something that could go above and beyond if we have a behavior by a company that is not diligent, that is not in line with what is required, that at least then a court could find and tell the company, please, carry out your impact assessment or pay for the damages. And I showed you this overview over these different cases that are currently pending, and many of these cases actually deal with illegal forest clearing, land clearing for palm oil production, I think, in many cases. So there is a lot of cases coming up your system, coming towards you, and it will be very interesting to develop a also consistent adjudication and legal response to these cases. But this is something I cannot say more about because this is at your doorsteps.
Okay, thank you, Professor Christina, for that question. I think there are several questions come up in my chat as well, but before that, saya mau kembali dulu ke Bapak dan Ibu yang ada di ruangan. Apakah Bapak dan Ibu yang ada di ruangan ada yang ingin saya lihat, ada yang mengangkat tangan?
Baik, terima kasih Bu Grita.
Ya, monggo Pak.
Saya Aryansyah dari PN Pasuruan. Yang ingin saya tanyakan about the future ideal of legal policy in Indonesia, which use the strategic of government policies right now is which is involved with investment, certainly make the environment itself reducing. So in your opinion, the honorable and very educated Prof Christine, what your suggest about the legal future, the future idea of legal policy itself in Indonesia? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Terima kasih Bapak. May I just collect 2 more questions, Professor Christina, if I may?
Absolutely.
Yeah. Sure. Boleh, Bapak dan Ibu, apakah ada lagi? Saya melihat ada juga yang bertanya. Ya, monggo Ibu.
Terima kasih. Saya Ibu Niwayan Wirawati dari Pengadilan Negeri Cianjur. Saya ingin menanyakan bagaimanakah pertanggungjawaban korporasi terhadap perubahan iklim atau climate change, dan bagaimanakah scientific evidence yang saat ini sedang berkembang, apakah bisa membuktikan suatu korporasi telah melakukan suatu suatu kerugian terhadap climate change, dan bagaimana juga terhadap greenwashing terhadap suatu produk yang menyatakan bahwa dia adalah mendukung perubahan iklim, tapi sebenarnya greenwash terhadap produk tersebut dia menggunakan bahan bakar fosil dan dia tidak mendukung deforestasi, pakai botolnya aja menggunakan botol dari plastik yang tidak bisa didegradasi dalam waktu mungkin 30 tahun atau 100 tahun, botol plastik yang seperti itu. Ya, terima kasih, itu dari saya.
Terima kasih Ibu. Boleh ada satu lagi Bapak dan Ibu jika ada?
Thank you for this opportunity. I just want to ask you something about climate change. How about your opinion, climate change connect with sustainable development? What kind of policy happens in Oslo, and what kind of advice that you give to Indonesia? Thank you.
Ya, terima kasih banyak Ibu. So we have 3 questions, Professor Christina. One is about how do you think about the future of the legal policy where the investment becomes the core of the objectives and give pressure to the environmental protection. What do you think about this, and about the corporate liability against the climate change? What are the scientific evidence that might be collected by the judges? And maybe it's also very interesting to hear about the greenwashing cases that you also mentioned before, and about the linkage of the climate change and sustainable development. Yeah, the time is yours, Professor.
Thank you so much, and thank you for these very, very important questions. They're difficult ones. They're not so easy to answer, but let me try. The first one on investment policy. I think this touches upon a very important point, because many countries, and Indonesia included, enter into investment agreements, bilateral investment agreements, bilateral or regional investment agreements. not many of these investment agreements, the main purpose of these agreements is to protect investor interests and protect their legitimate expectations, which basically is to make profit. And in many cases, they also restrain or constrain a government's freedom to adopt more stringent environmental legislation, because it would cut across against those legitimate expectations of investors. Now, this is currently a very interesting field to watch internationally, where many of these bilateral and regional investment agreements are being revised in order to include more stringent environmental and climate change provisions. Also give governments the freedom to change their laws, to change their acts, even if it leads to reduced return of investment for investors due to legal changes. But it is something that is happening as we speak. But I do believe, and I think we've seen several cases, that these investment treaties also can be reviewed against constitutional provisions, that government actually acts in accordance with what the Constitution requires a government to do, because that is the legal basis of judicial review for in general, or the starting point. And does the Constitution say something about environmental protection? And are these investment treaties and investment agreements in line with what the Constitution actually requires of the government? Another point here, which is actually very important and interesting. When I talked about the Paris Agreement, I only mentioned Article 2, Paragraph 1, that global temperature goal, keeping warming well below 2 degrees and down to 1.5 degrees. But Article 2 has 2 more goals. One deals with adaptation, and the third one actually deals with finance. And it has exactly the same legal normative standing as that temperature goal, which has been referred to in so many court decisions. But that finance goal has not been referred to that much or that often. And I think it's not so well known, but it's equally important. And that finance goal talks about making financial flows consistent with low greenhouse gas emission and climate resilient development. And it can be equally used as an interpretative tool to interpret financial decisions, financial regulation. Are they actually in line with what the Paris Agreement requires and is included in domestic law or not? And I think we will see more of this to come, but it hasn't really reached the courts yet. I just wanted to point this out. The second question, very interesting, corporate responsibility and causality for damages. And I mentioned that in my slides, that this is a very recent development, that we actually see cases against corporations that aim at compensation for climate damages. Now here, the question is more of an causation that is not sine qua non, meaning that that particular damage would not have happened without that company's contribution to climate change, because you can't do that. It's that global collective problem where you cannot single out particular contributions and link them to a particular damage. That is not possible. But what we're seeing currently is a contribution science, where every contribution to that global challenge, to that global problem, counts as a contribution that is valid in the context of compensation and liability. So it's not that sine qua non, but a contribution-based responsibility. And I think we've seen that early on also in criminal law, but it's something that is now making its way into corporate responsibility for climate change damages. We also have a development, at least here in Europe, towards mandatory due diligence requirements for companies. Companies, when they operate in their country of registration, but also along their supply chains, have an obligation of due diligence to assess and avoid negative social and environment impacts. And if it can be proven that they did not do that, they have a liability for those impacts that then are happening, including climate change impacts. This is a phenomenon that is fairly recent. I do not know if you have corporate mandatory due diligence requirements in Indonesia, but it's certainly something that is happening here in Europe, and it has a significant impact on corporate responsibility and liability. The second part of that second question was about greenwashing. And the interpreter said brainwashing, and I thought that was actually quite interesting twist of turn, because, you know, greenwashing is something that is targeting the consumers. They are supposed to believe that the production processes were green and environmentally friendly, and the product they're purchasing is wonderful in terms of climate change. And it leads to this kind of brainwashing where you know, people don't ask anymore. And in this context, it is so important that the information provided by companies is correct, and it is a disclosure of what is actually happening, and not any story that needs to be told. And there are requirements, there are legal requirements for consumer protection here in Europe, and I'm sure there are also legal requirements for consumer protection in Indonesia, where the consumers have a right to know the facts of production processes or of ecological footprints of products they are buying, where companies cannot just beautify themselves, but they have to comply with those consumer protection acts and laws and obligations. And it's those disclosure requirements that are currently being litigated in several courts in Europe, both in terms of companies saying they did not know about climate change, although they did know, or the other scenario is where they say, oh, we're doing everything to turn green, and then they have a small percentage of renewable energy, but 90% is still oil and coal, and then they change their logo from something brown to something nice and green, and consumers are supposed to believe that. And it just, this need to be concise and provide the truth to consumers and disclose what's actually happening. And I think here courts will have a really important role to play, because there are corporate interests in place that always seek to sideline the legal requirements. And the last question is a broader one. Sustainable development and climate change. It's a really important one, because it's the interaction between climate measures and sustainable development shouldn't be seen as two different boxes. And we can say we have to have development, but not at the expense of climate change. It has to be integrated. I think it's important to see that development cannot be sustainable if it doesn't tackle the challenge of climate change. Development can only be sustainable if it supports that global transformation to a low greenhouse gas and climate resilient future. And here, of course, it's an issue of global equity, where we have developed countries which over many centuries have gone ahead, cut down their forests, emitted fossil fuels by burning coal, and they have an historical responsibility. They have a historic responsibility to take the lead, but also to provide finance to developing countries, international finance, primarily ODA, official development assistance. So that developing countries can step in and take their role as well. And this links to Indonesia's conditional target in the NDC, because the increase from 27 to 41% of reductions is based on the availability of international finance, which is supposed to come from developed countries. So here's a really important obligation and role of developed countries to bring forward that finance. And you perhaps know, if you were in Glasgow last year, that goal of mobilizing $100 billion every year in climate finance was not reached. Parties put that in the decision, and they were very regrettable, and it was absolutely sad. But the fact still is that it was not reached. So every year that $100 billion need to be mobilized and put on the table so that developing countries like Indonesia can reach their conditional targets, so that the overall sum amounts to what is needed by climate change. But this is what I mean with integrating climate change, development, financial support into one consistent policy, not into silos, because development, I think, cannot be sustainable in a 2, 3, 4 degree warmer world. Then we look at chaos, we look at uncertainties, we look at insecurities, and perhaps even more conflict.
Yeah, thank you, Professor Christina. Actually, there are a few important questions again, actually, but we're again running out of time right now, unfortunately. But before you giving your closing statement, maybe you can also give us the participants, because considering that most of the participants in here are judges, would you like to give some hints maybe about what part of NDC, of what part of IPCC report that should be judges' attention when judges look into that documents? This is very important because you know that NDC and IPCC report is a huge and scientific documents, and it's maybe kind of hard or kind of difficult for the law enforcers to understand on. But if you would like to give some hints about which parts that maybe could be useful, maybe it's important for as well. And last thing that you also may say in the closing statement is about how do you see about how can the judges could form the decision which is executable for legal reform, because sometimes the challenges is about the execution of that decision, of the decision itself. So how judges could forming the executable decision, so all of the reform that we hope could be done. Maybe you can explain it in few sentences, and you can also give some closing statement and your hope to all of the participants in here.
Well, thank you so much. Well, let me start with the most specific questions, and then I share my hope with you. First, on the IPCC parts that may be particularly interesting for judges. Now, the IPCC report, the 6th assessment report, as I already said, has 3 parts. Working Group 1, Working Group 3, Working Group 3. And each part has published a report of over 2,000 pages. So that's much too much. You can't read all this. But each part has what it's called a summary for policymakers, which is a summary of those over 2,000 pages in about 20 to 30 pages. And these are the documents that I included in my presentation. And Grita, I'm happy to share this presentation with you because there are links and where these documents can be accessed. In my view, it is in particular the summary for policymakers, the shorter documents that are absolutely crucial for judges that need to use the science. And I've seen many cases, many decisions, judgments that refer to the IPCC as the most authoritative source of climate science. So I would encourage having a look at these summary for policymakers. They're available in different languages. I don't think in Indonesian, but I'm not entirely sure. And here it is the scientific basis, the report by the first working group, and it's in particular the last report, the mitigation on climate change, that just came out in April, because it details what every sector has to do, which changes we have to see in every sector of the economy, and it gives an indication of what needs to be done. in order to tackle? And also, what are the possibilities? It's not just about punishing, it's also about providing an alternative that also can be indicated, in a judgment where, for example, the government is requested to revise its policy in line with science or best available science, as an injunctive relief. But going on to the NDC, and you saw I included a screenshot or parts from the NDC in my presentation. The NDC is not too long. I can't remember. I think it has about 10, 15 pages. It's not a huge document. But again, it's a document that has very clear targets for each sector of the Indonesian economy. And it is maybe a very inspiring documents for judges to read. What are the plans? What does Indonesia want to do in order to comply with the Paris Agreement tools? The NDC itself is not legally binding unless it has been included in national legislation or decrees. But it can be used as an interpretative tool, because this is what the government internationally said they're gonna do. So it's perhaps very inspiring and interesting to have a look at the Indonesian NDC, which details the energy sector, the forest sector, the finance sector, industry, and so forth. What can judges? How can judges form decisions? I think this is a very important time to be a judge. I think it's a very different setting from perhaps anything we've seen before or we know before, because the climate science is clear, but the concrete measures to tackle climate change are not yet ambitious enough. We see governments not being or not living up to what actually the Paris Agreement says. And we have private actors that always try to find their way around and act in ways that are not in accordance with science or with the law. And that all comes together at the judiciary by the end of the day, where we have, in many cases, claimants, or here in the example of Indonesia, it's the Ministry of the Environment who's bringing claims against private actors, which is very interesting. And it's a particular moment of time for the judiciary to step in and to understand the scientific basis, understand the magnitude of climate change as a global challenge, but also understand the potential, the possibilities that the judiciary has in holding actors accountable to international agreements, but also to the national legal system that is in place, but also interpreting the provisions that you have in the light of climate change. I often tell my students that I would not want to be a judge these days. It's an enormous responsibility. It is a real important task. And we see so many young people who probably never thought of courts in their entire life, suddenly turning to judges, turning to the courts and asking for help, because they suddenly see the enormous power that the judiciary can have in tilting tilting behavior towards climate friendly and environmentally resilient future. I think I leave it at this here. I hope this is inspirational, but my hope comes from seeing so many young people stepping up and bringing cases to courts and asking the judiciary to take a role, take part in that global discourse and global fight, and in many cases walk out of the courtroom successfully.
Thank you, Professor Christina. And your statement is really, really bold and really important for us to, for judges as well, to think of. One of the statement that I really emphasize is that about the climate science is clear right now, and just the judges in here has important roles in tackling that, in tackling the climate change. And one thing that also you are emphasizes about the development cannot be sustainable if not tackling the climate change. So mencoba untuk meng-quote beberapa kalimat dari Profesor Christina bahwa the time is now or never. Profesor Christina berkali-kali mencoba untuk menyatakan kepada kita bahwa jika kita melewati window ini, maka mungkin kita tidak akan mencapai apa yang sudah menjadi target kesepakatan bersama, apa yang sudah menjadi target dari apa yang dinyatakan dalam Paris Agreement, misalnya Bapak dan Ibu. Jadi memang pada akhirnya peran Bapak dan Ibu menjadi sangat penting, peran Bapak dan Ibu menjadi sangat amat krusial di sini dalam tackling climate change di Indonesia tentunya. Baik, Bapak dan Ibu, saya rasa waktunya juga cukup sudah melewati. Bapak dan Ibu, saya mohon maaf jika ada pertanyaan Bapak dan Ibu yang mungkin belum sempat terakomodir. Saya ingin mengucapkan banyak-banyak terima kasih kepada Bapak dan Ibu, and also thank you Professor Christina for joining us today. Thank you for your time. And we are very much hoping to have you here and to have more discussion with you in the future for sure. Dan saya sekali lagi terima kasih banyak. Mungkin Pak Bambang ada yang ingin disampaikan terakhir, Bapak? Bapak masih di mute, mohon maaf ya.
Ya. Terima kasih Profesor Christina. Ini perjuangan kita semua, mudah-mudahan para hakim di Indonesia juga bisa menangkap inspirasi-inspirasi yang bisa menyemangati mereka. Dan saya berharap juga nanti barangkali salah satu atau mungkin salah 5 atau salah 10 dari hakim-hakim lingkungan bisa mengambil gelar master atau doktor di Universitas Oslo yang 2 minggu yang lalu kita sudah bahas di Oslo, Norwegia. Terima kasih sekali lagi untuk Profesor Christina. Sampai jumpa besok di Stockholm. Terima kasih Mbak Ninda. Saya ucapkan terima kasih untuk semuanya.
Ya, terima kasih banyak Pak Bambang. Baik Bapak dan Ibu, terima kasih banyak untuk kesempatannya. Acara mungkin dilanjutkan dengan penutupan Bapak dan Ibu. Silahkan, monggo saya kembalikan kepada panitia mungkin. Selamat siang. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Can I just very briefly express my gratitude? Thank you so much for everyone to having been here and listened and discussed. It's a really important topic, but I feel very privileged of having had that chance to be here with you for the last an hour and a half. And I'm very much looking forward to continuing the discussions, hopefully in person, but also tomorrow in Stockholm with you, Bambang. I'm looking forward to that. And I wish you all best of success. It's an important role that you have upon your shoulders. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Profesor Christina. Terima kasih banyak, Pak Bambang. Terima kasih banyak, Bapak dan Ibu. Saya kembalikan ke panitia mungkin. Terima kasih.
Baik, terima kasih Ibu Christina selaku narasumber, Pak Grita dan Pak Kepala Badan, sekaligus semua pihak yang ikut terlibat dalam kelas inspirasi. Saya ucapkan terima kasih banyak. Untuk acara selanjutnya yang ingin disampaikan kepada Bapak dan Ibu adalah acara penutupan. Saya mohon sekali lagi kepada Bapak dan Ibu untuk terlebih dahulu mengisi kursi yang ada di depan, karena tidak sampai 10 menit lagi acara penutupan akan segera dimulai. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.